one of the things that we've been doing a little bit of research on is how the pandemic has affected children, school-age children, with anxiety and depression. So I thought I'd give you a few facts. So the ongoing stress, fear, grief, and uncertainty that's been created by COVID has weighed pretty heavily on our children. I'm sure you guys have all experienced this. And I think that when in my field, we see lots and lots of adults who are also struggling with this. And so you can imagine if people are struggling with this as adults, children have a much less sophisticated understanding of what's going on, and so it tends to affect them differently. So here's what we've learned thus far about the pandemic. So more than 140,000 children in the United States have experienced the death of a parent or a grandparent or a caregiver from COVID. So for example, sorry, I missed that. Children of racial and ethnic minorities have been hit even harder. So research shows that they've had up to 4.5 times the risk of losing a caregiver to COVID compared to other kids. And this is a fairly new statistic, and I expect that this statistic will actually rise. So the CDC estimates that mental health emergency room visits have risen 24% for children ages 5 to 11 and 31% for children ages 12 to 17. There's also been more than a 50% increase in suspected suicide attempts by girls ages 12 to 17 in early 2021, as compared to our pre-pandemic statistics. Now, one of the interesting things about statistics is that we're usually about 2 years behind. And so these came out in 2021. My suspicion is when we get these statistics in 2023, they're going to be higher. So I think about, in addition to the stress from the pandemic, I think about all the things that our children are facing today that maybe you and I didn't face when we were kids. So for example, I don't know very many children who haven't been exposed to some sort of school violence in terms of at least having a secure lockdown or exposed to some vicarious trauma. So this could be through media. I mean, when we think about what our kids can see on the news, what they see in everyday programming, it's pretty scary. So when we see that they have not only had these experiences with having the school shut down, they're seeing and hearing about other schools that are being shot up. It's very scary for them. Then add to this, there's some issues of bullying, and sometimes in ways that parents and teachers are not even aware of. So for example, in a recent study, they found that kids are less and less likely to actually report school bullying. And partially it's because, at least according to this study, that they feel like they're going to be discounted. So when you think about all of those things, you think about COVID, you think about vicarious trauma, you think about the trauma of having to practice school lockdowns and things like that, it's a pretty good recipe for anxiety and depression in school-age children. Again, we want to note that children don't have the sophisticated coping mechanisms that we as adults may have. And please feel free to ask questions. You can either put them in the chat or you can just interrupt me. I have no problem with you interrupting me if you have a question as we're going. So one of the things that sometimes people have difficulty with is trying to understand, so what's a regular developmental stage, or what's something that's just normal, and what's something that might be a concern that I need to get help with? So I think it's important to remember that all children have periods of sadness or anxiety or irritability. It's pretty normal developmentally to even have episodes of aggression, and it's developmentally appropriate to have challenges with like sitting still or interacting with your peers. But when things go on for an extended period of time, and usually what I tell parents is, if your child is experiencing behavior that you haven't seen before and it lasts for longer than 2 weeks, you should seek some help. So let's talk a little bit about warning signs of depression and anxiety. And some of these, I think, are a little bit subtle sometimes. So for instance, a symptom could be that they seem more sad, or here's another one, and people often mistake this for behavior when they say, man, this kid is just irritable all the time. That's a very good red flag if you're seeing that and you haven't seen that in the past, that your child might have a symptom of depression or anxiety. And usually what we talk about when we're talking about symptoms is that this happens for most of the day and for at least 2 weeks. If they're no longer enjoying activities that they previously enjoyed, like, for instance, maybe they really like sports or they really liked after-school activities and suddenly they don't want to do it, and there's no real reason that they don't want to do it, they're just, I don't want to do it. That's a concern. If they're spending more time alone and less time with friends and family members. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. When you're talking about adolescents tend to have these stages where they want to have a little more alone time. What I'm going to say is, let's look at it as a whole. So what you want to do is, do they have more than one of these? If it's just maybe one of these symptoms, then probably it's not depression or anxiety, or at least it's not depression and anxiety to the severity that you would actually need to go and get professional help. If a child starts having trouble falling asleep, or they're sleeping a really long period of time. Now, again, remember that we need to take this within developmental context. So often when children are going through growth spurts, or when they're going from one developmental stage to another. So for instance, teenage boys, when they hit about 12 or 13, tend to need a lot more sleep than they've needed in the past. Part of that is because they're starting to grow, and your body needs extra energy when it's growing. If they are having difficulty focusing or making choices, and that's not been something that you've seen in the past, that could be a symptom. If they are really struggling or failing at school and this is not their norm, that's a concern. One of the things that we see, particularly in children who are probably between the ages of 6 and 8 or 9, when they start to feel depressed or anxious, they may start refusing to go to school or making lots and lots of excuses. Like, for instance, they may say, my tummy hurts. I can't go to school today. My tummy hurts. And then you realize, wow, their tummy has hurt every day for 2 weeks. It's probably something that you need to pay attention to. Often we also see, and this happens more in adolescents than in young children, but you do sometimes see a marked change in their weight or their eating, so either up or down. So often there are children who, when they feel depressed or anxious, stop eating. And then there are other children who maybe start eating to try to self-soothe. And so that, again, is one of those things that we would want to make sure that you're paying attention to. If they're talking less and making less eye contact than usual, they're spending more time doing escapism activities such as video games. Now, that one's a really tough one because we have a whole generation of video game kids and screen time kids. So you as the parent would know what's normal and what's not normal for them in terms of screen time. And then one of the big ones that I tend to look at a lot when I'm seeing kids is, how's their energy? How's their energy level and their motivation level? Children who are between the age, these school-age children should have at least enough energy that they have some bounce in their steps. They're going through their daily routine and they're just being kids. When you see depressed and anxious children, you tend to see kids who can barely keep their eyes open, who maybe they haven't been taking naps for a very long time, and suddenly they come home and they're napping for 2 or 3 hours. And still, it's not disrupting a sleep pattern. Those are things that are pretty typical red flags. And then this one is a very typical red flag for depression and anxiety. When you have a child who's crying more often, or they mention that life just doesn't seem good for them, they feel worthless or they feel guilty. We'll tell you, I just saw a little boy not that long ago who he felt guilty about, and I don't think his parents did this with this intent, but they would say things like, hey, you need to eat everything on your plate, because they're starving children in whatever country they chose. And so this little boy developed this significant guilt about these starving children, and he had lots of food, but he didn't want the food, but he couldn't send it to them. And so we had to do a little bit of work and help him with that. Any questions thus far? I think that we see this quite a bit with teenagers, where they just get into that, and preteens, so 11 to 16, 17, where they just don't care about the future, or they feel hopeless. Now, there's a little bit of that I think is probably normal when you're hearing on the news that, we hear all sorts of things about the piling debt. We hear about environmental concerns. Kids take that pretty seriously. And I think that sometimes it inspires a sense of hopelessness. Then again, they have a lack of interest in personal grooming or appearance. One of the things that I look for is, what are they wearing? And is it normal? Is it the normal clothes that they normally wear, or have they developed some other clothing styles? I will tell you, one of the ones that I look for the most, I look to see if kids have hoodies on. And if a kid has a hoodie on and they pull it down over their face, then I'm going to probably talk to them about depression and anxiety and ask them what that's about. If that's something that your kid's always done, then that wouldn't necessarily be a symptom. And we see lots and lots and lots and lots of statistics that support this one. Kids, when they get depressed or anxious, often turn to substance use to help mediate their feelings, because they're really not sure what else to do. And substance use definitely tends to numb or take them out of those feelings. So if your child hasn't engaged in substance use behaviors and you notice that, or you think that there might be, I'm always going to tell you, seek help when you have a child who you think might be using substances. It's much, much, much more effective if you can catch those behaviors when they first start versus when the child's had some time in those behaviors. Does that make sense to everybody? So one of the things that we talk a little bit about with parents here at Sequoia is we talk about children and teens don't always know how to describe what's going on for them. How many of you have seen adults who don't always know how to describe what's going on for them? And I think that this is pretty typical in kids. They're not really quite sure how to describe how they're feeling. Or one of the things that we have seen lately, kids are kind of trying to hide their feelings because they don't want to add more stress to their parents. And I think that can become very dangerous for your child. So how can parents help? I think the very first and probably one of the most important things is understand the symptoms of depression and anxiety. And remember that kids who are experiencing anxiety and depression aren't making up symptoms. They're not trying to get attention. And what might look like laziness or irritability are pretty common symptoms of anxiety and depression. It's really easy to have this time with your kids where you're sort of trying to force them to talk to you. But I'm going to tell you it's not effective ever. Never works. So instead, it's easier if you support some safe spaces where you can talk openly and honestly, but you have to be careful about judgment and some of the things that we might say that seem like a great idea at the time. But remember, kids ruminate on the things that you say, and they may not have the sophistication to separate, okay, well, this is what they meant. They're rarely going to ask you for clarification. They're rarely going to say, here's what I hear you saying. They're not going to say that. So one of the things that I have found to be super helpful, if you want to have a difficult conversation or you think this conversation that you're going to have might be stressful, have them do something with their hands. So sometimes it's useful to play a game while you're talking or take them for a drive. I think that sometimes when we're driving, it really helps because it's kind of like a natural sort of progression. You're driving with your kid, you look at them and say, so how are things? What have you been doing lately? And it doesn't seem like, oh, it's time for the talk or the conversation. One of the biggest things that I see when I'm working with children and adolescents is they don't understand the difference between having a symptom and having something wrong with them. And so one of the things that I try to do from the get-go is let them know there's nothing wrong with you. You have symptoms of depression or you have symptoms of anxiety. And hey, here's the great news. It's fairly easy to treat. And when you can approach them in that manner where you're reassuring them that, you know what, depression and anxiety are pretty common. Lots of people have experienced it. And in fact, I'm guessing that most of you have had at least one moment of anxiety or depression in your life. And so if you can say, you know what, I've been anxious in my life, or hey, you know what, when I watched that on the news, it made me feel anxious. It made me feel kind of weird. And that's kind of the other part is if you're watching something or you hear something and it makes you feel anxious, understand that that's going to make your kid feel anxious too. And it might be a really good idea for you to just stop, take a moment and say, you know what? I didn't like that either. That didn't feel great to me either. What do you think we could do to help ourselves out right now? I think that as parents, when something's wrong with our children, we want to fix it. We want to make sure that it's fixed and we want to fix it as quickly as possible. But I think sometimes when we do that, what happens is that we lose our empathy and our flexibility because we want this to be done. I don't want to see my kids suffer like this anymore. Instead, if you focus on their strengths and you talk about the things that they're really good at, it helps to give hope. It helps to show them that, hey, yeah, I get this. You're having some hard times. And by the way, I never say but, because I think that when you say but, it tends to negate whatever else you're going to say. I say, and you know what? You've done a really good job getting through some things before. You did this. You didn't think you could do it, and you did it, and it turned out great. Using those kind of examples help build your child's confidence, helps them to realize that, hey, I could probably handle this too. So we're focusing on strengths rather than what needs improvement. We're providing that verbal encouragement, you can do this, but in a way that doesn't feel like it's fake or that we're trying too hard. I don't know, I was talking to a parent the other day and she was telling me about how discouraging it sometimes gets because she said, it seems like everything's a participation trophy. And I said, oh. She said, I just feel like if I'm encouraging my kid all the time and I'm saying, you can do this, that I'm just giving him a participation trophy. I said, well, or we could look at it like we're building layers of confidence every time we give encouragement versus saying, good job, you got out of bed today. We're saying things like, you have the ability to get through this. You've done this before. You've succeeded with this. You've done that. Giving them examples and then giving them praise for those examples helps to build confidence. I also like to use some reframing, and you don't have to be a professional to reframe things. One of the easiest ways to reframe negative perceptions is to say something like, when they say, everything sucks, you reframe it by saying, right now, it probably seems like everything sucks. And it won't always be this way. I'm guessing you've had things suck before in your life, and you've had times when things didn't suck. And then I think that one of the things that is super, super important is finding some options and alternatives for relaxation. So showing them things like, hey, let's take a walk. Let's have 5 minutes of quiet time. Let's just practice breathing. If you have a kid who knows how to do deep breathing, ask them to teach you how to do deep breathing. And quite frankly, that is probably one of the best things that you can do to help your child get on board with you in almost any situation, is to say, I know you know how to do this, but I'm not sure I know how to do it. Can you teach me how to do this? Can you teach me this great thing that you did? Can you teach that to me? Can you show me how you did that? Kids like to be the expert. As I said before, sometimes it's hard to be patient and calm when it's your kid. It's easy to get annoyed when your kid's being moody or, they're displaying challenging behaviors. However, it's much more effective to be non-reactive. So we are not normally non-reactive. That's not a natural state for most of us. You might have to practice a little bit. One of the things that my kids still tease me today about, they're adults now, and they tease me about, I used to have this one saying that I used to say to them. I'd say, well, with every choice, there's a consequence, when they would do something that they knew they weren't supposed to do. And I would never have a reaction other than to say that. Well, with every choice, there's a consequence. You make good choices, you get good consequences. This was not a great choice. And then we went from there. They still tease me about that to this day, because they said, man, we used to try to come up with some things to throw you off your game, and you would always just continue to say that one thing. It's good to have a statement and to be able to practice that in a way that you're not having a reaction. I don't know if you remember when your children first started to walk. One of the things that they would do is they toddle along and then they fall, and the very first thing that they do is they look at you, and they're like, "Am I okay? Am I all right?" And if you went, "Yay!" they would get up and try it again. But if you were like, "Oh my God!" then immediately they would start crying. So this is the same concept, being non-reactive and still being encouraging and calm and patient. So I think that this is actually, I'm sorry, this should have been fixed. So I think that one of the other things that we can all do is just provide resources to each other, get resources from, it's pretty easy now. We have lots and lots and lots of resources that are available to us. And so finding some really great resources and sharing those. I think it's good for you to reach out to your child's pediatrician and ensure that they have a good physical checkup. There are some physical symptoms that mimic anxiety and depression, such as there are some children who have thyroid issues. There are children who have ADHD, and sometimes those symptoms mimic depression and anxiety. So we want to make sure they have a good physical checkup. And then I think that one of the other things that we can do is support having our kids be with other kids. They tend to learn better from their peers. They have this sort of innate distrust, I think, of things that older people say to them initially. They're like, Were you ever a kid? I have to assure some of the kids that I work with, yes, I was once a kid. I know I look really old, but I was once a kid. And I think that goes a long way. So sometimes we have different places that you can get this, but most schools right now are having different kinds of peer-led groups. They could be called friendship groups. They could be called how to manage stress or how to talk with adults, that sort of thing. Then we can talk a little bit about preventive factors that parents can help build. Again, you're going to support those safe places to talk openly. And in order to do that, we have to be able to be that calm, non-judgmental, non-reactive person. If your child understands that they can talk with you about all of their feelings, they're going to be less likely to try to keep things under wraps. Teach and model strong social and emotional intelligence skills. If you go to Google, you can just Google emotional intelligence skills, and you'll get pages and pages and pages and pages. But generally, our kids learn from us, and they learn by the things that we do. So if you're modeling mindfulness and non-judgmental awareness and learning how to understand that emotions are just emotions, they come and they go, thoughts come and they go, that will really, really help your child to not get so tied up in some of the thoughts and feelings that they have. I think that we create resiliency in our children by teaching them that they have the answers. They can get through this. They know how to do this. And we're right there beside them. I'll help you if you need help. If you don't need me to hold your hand, I won't hold your hand, but I'll be here no matter what. Encourage positive friendships. And I think that there's so much research that shows that children who have really good social skills and have positive friendships have a much higher likelihood of having a lot of success in their life. Now, it doesn't mean, this isn't measured by the number of friends that they have. I have had parents come to me and say, well, I'm really worried about my child because they only have 3 or 4 friends. And I say, oh, okay. Well, even if they just have one good friend, that's a protective factor. And we don't have to freak out because they're not going to win the popularity contest today. That's not a big deal. The bigger deal is, do they have friends that they can trust? Can they talk with their friends? I think that having a sense of purpose really helps children as well. This could be finding a sport that they really like, finding something that they're good at, finding something that makes them feel good. I have taken kids to volunteer at food pantries where they pack boxes, and they will say things like, that was really fun. And I'm really glad that I got to make sure that little kids are going to have something to eat, or they're going to have they'll be able to have a snack. All of those things are really important. So the key here, when you're trying to find something that your child likes, is asking and listening to what they say. So don't assume just because it would be meaningful to you that it will be meaningful to your child. Questions thus far?
Or comments? Any questions or comments? You feel free to unmute and go ahead and speak up. If you have some issue that you're thinking about, somebody else may have the same issue.
I'm going to say that one of the important things is don't let your child go with symptoms for longer than 2 weeks. And if it's longer than 2 weeks, that's when you need to seek professional assistance. And that's what we call early intervention. It's much, much easier to get a handle on some of these things the sooner that we do them. It doesn't mean that if your child's been depressed for longer than 2 weeks that we can't help you. That doesn't mean that at all. It simply means it's easier for them and easier for you if you can catch this quite early.
So Kathy, I've heard that people are sometimes having a hard time getting care, that there aren't enough therapists, or, there's a long waiting list. Any tips for people about that?
I wish that there were more tips, but one thing that I will tell you is if you can't get your child in, feel free. At the end of this presentation, I put up my email address, and feel free to contact me, and I can try to help you. If you have Oregon Health Plan or you have Trillium Health Plan, Sequoia does see children, and we don't have a long waiting list. So we've done some strategies to make sure that we're getting people in quickly, and you would never experience more than a 2-week wait to get in to see one of my therapists. I would also say, I was just talking with somebody earlier today, and it's the organization is called Youth Outreach, and they currently have 7 counselors in area schools that are embedded, that are paid for by their organization. So it's always useful to ask if your school has a school counselor or someone that your child could talk to.
Is that Youth Contact?
It is.
Mm.
So I'm going to give you some crisis resources, because we do know that it is very difficult right now to get mental health services. And so I want to make sure that you have somebody that you can reach out to, somebody who could help. And so I'll make sure that these resources get out to everyone. But we have some different, we have some walk-in resources, and then we also have crisis text lines and reach out lines. And then if you go down a little bit further, I put in some parent information. And so these are just resources for parents who want to know more about depression or anxiety, more clinical resources for adolescents and children. And I guarantee you, if you go to these websites, there's probably 50 more pages of resources that they have on their websites as well.
So these slides will be sent out to participants. Jessica's going to be doing that after the presentation tonight. And so, you will be able to get those and follow up if you wish to make any of those contacts. Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you being on this call tonight, and hope that it's been useful for you. And we hope to see you again in our future presentations. Thank you so very much. Good evening.
Bye.